It's bigger than biotech.
Hello, and welcome back to another episode of It's Bigger Than Biotech. I'm your host, Vijay Gondalia, a director at True Drug Pharma and also a student at USC.
And I'm Vishnu, a software engineer and machine learning and neuroscience researcher, aspiring to be a neurotech entrepreneur, also here at SC.
And today we have an incredible guest with us, Dr. Lawrence Liberti. Dr. Liberti has spent over 4 decades pioneering regulatory science, guiding global pharmaceutical policies, and mentoring the next generation of biotech professionals. He currently serves as the director of the DK Kim International Center for Regulatory Science at USC, where he is driving research and education in regulatory affairs. From his early days at Wyatt Laboratories to co-founding Astrolabe Analytica and leading CIRS, which is the Center for Innovation and Regulatory Science, and also supporting regulatory capacity building through the Erudi Foundation. His impact on the industry is definitely undeniable. In today's episode, we'll explore his journey through regulatory science, the evolution of global medicine approval pathways, and what the future holds for biotech startups navigating complex regulatory landscapes. Whether you're a student, an entrepreneur, or a seasoned industry professional, this conversation is one you wouldn't want to miss. Yeah, so let's jump right in. So, yeah,
Wonderful. Thanks, guys, for having me. This sounds like a lot of fun, and I'm really uh, looking forward to our conversation for the next hour or so.
Yeah, definitely. We just wanted to start you off just so our viewers can have some context. Like you've had a long and impactful career in regulatory science. So could you give us an overview of your role as the director of the DK Kim International Center for Regulatory Science and what excites you the most about it?
I think part of the story is how I got to be the director of the DK Kim International Center. I'm a pharmacist, and right after pharmacy school, I went and got my degree in pharmacognosy, which pharmacists will know is the study of natural products for foods and medicines. And it turns out that back in the 70s, when I got my master's, there weren't a whole lot of jobs for pharmacognosy. So I ended up getting a job working in the pharmaceutical industry. And I started in an area that I knew very little about. It was called stability and package evaluation. But it was a great job, and it was a good company called Wyeth Labs, which eventually uh, became part of Pfizer Laboratories. We had a lot of fun, and I learned a lot. And I was writing a lot. I was doing a lot of technical writing. So a job opened up in the clinical department within Wyeth Labs. And what was interesting at the time is that the clinical department was very, very aligned with regulatory. So almost daily, we would interact with our colleagues in regulatory. And I found what they were doing to be fascinating. The job I had then gave me the ability to see everything from pilot plant and discovery straight on through to pharmacovigilance. In fact, I did work in pharmacovigilance for a while before leaving Wyeth. And I left there with this broad understanding of how drug development worked, how the regulatory section fit within the whole process. I ended up leaving Wyeth and then going to a couple of companies before starting my own company with some friends. And we did regulatory support for the pharmaceutical industry. And we developed this Astrolabe product that you were talking about, which was a very unique way of evaluating medical literature. And eventually, we sold that company to a big company called Thomson Reuters. And the reason I'm going through this is that this has been a very circuitous path. Very few people of my generation went to school and said, I want to become a regulatory person, trained and then jumped into regulatory. So that circuitous path took me then to this company called Thomson Reuters. And after the integration of my company into Thomson Reuters, they said, we have this little organization. It's operated as a nonprofit, and it's called the Center for Innovation in Regulatory Science. And the fellow who established it, Professor Stuart Walker, is retiring, and we'd like somebody to take over. And I thought, this sounds pretty interesting. I have had a lot of regulatory experience and some global interactions. And I jumped in and became the director of CIRS, as you mentioned, CIRS. And I did that for about a dozen years. And it was a wonderful experience because with that very small organization, about a dozen people, we had a huge impact. And to this day, CIRS has an enormous impact on things like regulatory statistics and regulatory metrics. And if you go to their website, lots of really great information. What that did was it gave me the opportunity to interact with pharmaceutical companies and regulators from all around the world. And I thought it was time to retire. Next thing I know, I got a call from Professor Pacifici, who leads the Department of Regulatory and Quality Science within the Mann School of Pharmacy. And she said, Larry, we've got this very small unit called the DK Kim International Center for Regulatory Science. It needs a full-time director. We'd like it to grow internationally. And because of your experiences with everything you've done with the industry and with agencies and with CIRS, we think perhaps you might be an appropriate person for this. So I went through this very extensive interview process. And at the end of the day, I was offered the opportunity to become the director of the DK Kim Center. It is named that after our benefactor, Mr. DK Kim, who had a very good vision to say, how can we use regulatory science concepts to improve healthcare worldwide? That's a very forward-looking idea. And so to come to your original question is, what do I do within the DK Kim Center? I take all of these experiences that I've had for the last 40 years, working with industry, looking at research, looking at the ways that agencies interact and approve medicines, together with the work that I did for my doctorate. So my doctorate was received from Utrecht University in the Netherlands in a joint program with the World Health Organization. So my doctorate is in the area of international regulatory policy. And that added to the experiences that I had, so that when I came to the Kim Center, we kind of hit the road running. And we said, what can we do to improve the global regulatory arena and add to all the other good work that pharmaceutical companies, trade associations, regulatory agency associations, and others are doing to improve the way that we can speed the availability of quality medicines to patients? So one thing that's unique about the Kim Center is that we are academic. We sit within a university. And there are very, very few organizations like ours that are academic based. And that means that we have access to a lot of research. So what we've been doing is aggregating the doctoral research that is done within the Department of Regulatory and Quality Science, student undergraduate research, faculty research, and others. And we've kind of mapped that against problems that occur around the world in regulatory. And we're at a point now where we've figured out that we can take this information and we can tailor it to address specific issues that need to be improved, either in a country or a region or globally. And so the mission of the Kim Center to be able to use regulatory science to improve health of patients is supported by this amazing research that's being done within our organization to be able to apply that to these different activities. So I hope that's given you a little bit of a winding road of how I got to where I am and how all of those experiences are helping now to support the Kim Center.
Yeah, I mean, wow, like it's definitely been a very unique journey that you've had. Definitely starting in a completely different field and moving on into regulatory science. It's absolutely phenomenal. But one thing I wanted to ask was that you specifically talked about Astrolib Analytica and the Astrolib way of looking at literature, regulatory literature. Could you elaborate a bit more on that? What is that way of looking at literature?
Right. So we have to talk about it in the past tense because the product no longer exists. But when we started it about 25 years ago, you have to understand this was just as the internet was coming into its own. And things like PDFs of documents, of articles, didn't exist. So we had to go out and manually search the literature for specific information about different products that we were assessing. And it all came together because what happened was we were working with a pharmaceutical company, and one of the people involved in medical information said, look, Larry, I've got this pile of really key documents about my product. And here's a stack of really key products about my competitor. Now, if you were a pharmacist, which I am, or a doctor, and you read pile A about my product and pile B about the other one, what would you know? Like, what would be the positive things you've learned about my product and the other one? What are some of the negative things? What are some of the confusing things? Where would you like to learn more about? We actually developed an algorithmic process whereby our analysts went through all of this information, extracted information, and then we curated the information into a website that people accessed. And we illustrated this information in very, very unique, novel ways so that product managers, people in drug information, and other aspects of the pharmaceutical companies would be able to understand what was impacting their product in terms of the scientific literature. Today, with AI, with pushing a button, going to ChatGPT and all these others, a lot of that can be automated. But 25 years ago, this was absolutely novel. And that's why, in part, we were acquired by Thomson Reuters to bring that technology into their databases, which some of that still exists. Some of that DNA is still finding its way through their products. Yeah.
Now, in terms of recruitment, right? I know that you've worked for lots of different companies and lots of different organizations. What skills and mindsets do you think are essential for someone looking to enter the field of regulatory science?
Yeah, it's a great question. So let's take the situation of a person who has graduated from university, maybe has the master's in regulatory science, right? And has not worked anywhere before.
Yeah.
The things that people are looking for nowadays, and everybody tells me this, the number one thing is the ability to communicate and to work in teams. You need to be able to get your points across verbally, clearly, but also to be able to write clearly. Report writing, text writing, writing emails is so important to get that right. And especially if you're communicating to regulators, that has to be very, very accurate. So the ability to communicate is super important. And then also, this is a team sport. Nobody does regulatory on their own. And as I had mentioned, regulatory is kind of the one of the few groups within a pharmaceutical company that, as I say, sees the whole elephant. People in clinical are brilliant at understanding clinical, and people in chemistry, manufacturing, control understand production and how to get those products together in quality. But regulatory sits on top of all of this. So you need to be a bit of a generalist to be able to have a conversation with a chemist about chemistry, manufacturing, controls, about maybe with a pharmacologist about the mechanism of action. Why is that important for a regulatory submission? A little bit of that background knowledge is certainly helpful. I found as a pharmacist, I was trained to be able to be conversant in all of those. But, as if you major in biological sciences and chemistry and biochemistry, you could be equally versatile in that ability to converse. So those would be two important things: is being part of a good team and a good player in a team, and then communicating. I say the one other thing that I think people look for is the ability to be a good time and project manager. No one thing happens in regulatory. It's always 10 things at once. So being able to keep things aligned, move them along, be sure that everybody's contributing what they need to do, be that team coordinator. That's a very important skill. And showing that you can project manage more than one thing at a time is important.
That makes sense. You talked about, I guess, like regulatory sciences and what specific things people look for right now and even before in someone who wants to work in regulatory. Now, how do, I guess, hiring needs differ from like academia or nonprofits like the Erudi Foundation and regulatory science organizations as well?
It's a great question. So if we think about what people in regulatory science do, let's take the ones you talked about. So there are those who work in the industry, and there's no one way of entering regulatory in the industry. There are different aspects of regulatory. So you might go into what's called regulatory operations, reg ops as they call it. This is where those folks understand how to take material and assemble it in a very sophisticated way in a dossier that then gets submitted
Mhm.
to a regulatory agency. Reg ops people are specialists in that. Then there's regulatory affairs people who have a pretty good sense of what are the regulations that I need to meet and comply with across the whole life cycle of my product. So that's a little bit different in regulatory. For the more senior and seasoned people, then there's regulatory policy. And regulatory policy specialists take a more global look or maybe a regional look, and they're trying to shape the environment so that it becomes more and more efficient as time goes by. So within the industry, there might be several different ways of looking for people who have different kinds of skills. But if I work for a non-governmental organization, if I worked for a foundation like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, I may not be as interested in regulatory operations. I'm not assembling anything, but that's where things like regulatory policy become more important. And they may be looking for somebody who has a better sense of international scope and international activities. Big and small pharma differ also. So, for instance, if you go into a very large multinational, they might be organized by region, and you might specialize in a particular region. On the other hand, if you work for a very, very small startup company, you might not have the skills to lead the regulatory division, but it might be your senior leader, maybe your vice president of regulatory, and you and one or two other people, and you're the entire regulatory department. And you get thrown into the pit to learn everything from labeling to reg ops to submission procedures and all of keeping up with regulatory policy. So depending on the nature of the organization you're in, even within pharma, you might have some very unique experiences that you wouldn't have in a different kind of organization. And I'll just finish by saying also, I don't mean to imply that there's only medicines, right? Regulatory people get involved with things like devices. Devices are a whole other world unto themselves, just like medicines are. And there are specialists in the device industry, in device regulatory, device regulations, device policy. So depending on where your interests lie, you might focus on medicines, you might focus on devices, two broad areas.
Makes sense. I think one thing that stood out was if you're in regulation and want to go international as well, learning that policy matters a lot, right? Um, Given your experience collaborating with regulatory agencies across different markets, so what advice would you give for students or professionals aiming to work in global regulatory policy?
That's brilliant. I think the one word is patience. And that's because the inertia that exists in some organizations is great. And let's call it bureaucracy. It's not in a pessimistic way, but the structures sometimes make it difficult for things to change. And although people who work there and the outside influences want things to change, it may be difficult. The laws may be written in a way that prevent them from changing. And even though everybody wants to, it can't happen until the law is changed. So trying to interact at a national level with different agencies requires a lot of patience. The other problem that one will run into is that no two agencies are alike. So no two agencies have the exact same regulations, have the same regulatory pathways. Yeah, there's a flavor that crosses all of them. But when you get down to the nuances, they can be great, and they can actually be the ones that give you the most trouble. So really focusing in on something that you're going to become an expert in. So you might be an expert in Asian regulatory or Southeast Asian regulatory or African regulatory or even South African region regulatory. There, depending on how the companies are organized, you may be that specialized in just being responsible for a cluster of countries. So having the ability to focus is really important. But even then, recognizing that some things are going to take quite a while before they actually change is important. I'll give an example. What happens in Latin America often is that there are elections every couple of years. And when the elections happen, sometimes the whole government changes. There's a new head of government. And what was happening before, let's say in the health ministry, was predicated by the person in charge of the health ministry. But now the new government comes in and they say, sorry, pal, you don't have a job anymore. And they put somebody else in place. And now all of a sudden, a country that was very gung-ho to be part of international, excuse me, activities like ICH or other kinds of international norms, start seeing the agency pull back a bit because the new people aren't so much involved with international. They don't really care that much about it. So people who were working with that agency for the last 3, 4 years and thought they were moving in the right direction, all of a sudden now they take 3 steps backwards and they have to start almost all over again. And that's why I say patience is so critical, because just when you think you've got the breakthrough, something out of your control, like a change in government, may happen, and it can have a really significant impact on the regulations and the way that the government agencies work.
Yeah, most definitely. I mean, you very rightly mentioned knowing about different regulatory agencies you want to work at. There's so many around the world, and there's a lot of harmonization efforts happening around the world. Let's say you have a unique goal, a professional has a unique goal of looking into how they can improve harmonization efforts. It's not a very common, maybe like a field you go down, but how would you kind of advise someone who's looking into go into multidisciplinary regulatory countries for harmonization?
That also is a very good question. Harmonization comes from the activities of many people and many groups. No single group can drive harmonization. And in fact, the term harmonization has kind of gone away a little bit. More being used now is the term alignment. So let's try to align what we're doing rather than actually saying we're all harmonized and we're singing Kumbaya. That may not be possible in some cases because of the laws and things we talked about. But we can start aligning regulations, we can start aligning laws and trying to make them so that it's more predictable for the users of these regulations to see consistency from one jurisdiction to another. So if I'm somebody who says, boy, I'm really interested in bringing alignment to the world, right, or to a region, that's where regulatory policy comes in. The regulatory policy are the people who are taking these long-term views of what's going on and saying, what is it that we need to do at the local level to inform country A and country B and country C that they have divergent regulations, and that actually, if they moved a little bit more in one direction or another, they can start bringing their divergent regulations together and aligning them more. That takes a lot of effort. Again, uh, people change within the organizations. You think you've got it all managed, and before you know it, those people have left, and you have to start re-educating the next group of people. Um, you may have trade associations that are for multinational companies, which have a particular viewpoint. Then a trade association for the national industry may have a different viewpoint. And sometimes that may be in conflict of the viewpoint from the multinational industry. So one has to balance these different needs, different approaches, and that's where understanding diplomacy, understanding what is possible, what are the what do they say, low-hanging fruits that one can work with to change and implement small changes that eventually may lead to bigger changes is really important. So I don't know that it would be easy for someone with, let's say, less experience to immediately jump in and say, hey, you know what I want to do? I want to work in regulatory harmonization. They could get a job, perhaps with a nonprofit or an NGO that has that motivation, and they might be given more responsibility to be able to move in that direction. That's one way that they can think about accelerating that. Within the large pharma, I think they would probably need a little bit more experience before they move that way. But every drop of water on the stone helps.
Now, since you've talked a lot about regulatory science and I guess just the paths for regulation, right? Making sure that everything is following regulation. I want to move towards, I guess, startups. Many aspiring biotech entrepreneurs struggle with understanding regulatory frameworks. What steps should founders of startups take early on to ensure a smoother regulatory path for their innovations?
Yeah. And I've seen this for decades, right? Because the small startup company has a number, well, brilliant participants to start the company. They understand the technology better than anybody, and they understand the route that they need to take to develop the technology from a technical standpoint, right? But they have to ask the question is, what do I want at the end? And then work backwards. I'll give you an example. I was just talking to a person in a small company, and I said, well, at the end, do you want to get approval and market your product? Do you want to control that whole thing? And they said, no, no. What I want to do is I want to license it. I want to sell it to a big pharma company. I said, great. I said, so how are you preparing yourself for that? Oh, they said, well, we've got really great animal studies and we know we can have pretty good clinical studies. We've got a specialist in designing clinical studies. I said, okay, great. Well, I said, what facilitated regulatory pathways, what specialized routes, regulatory routes are you thinking of using? He said, I don't know what you're talking about. I said, well, you could go for breakthrough therapy designation or fast track early on, or, do you think that this is meeting an unmet medical need and you want to go through accelerated approval? Wow, I said, I hadn't really thought about that. Well, I said, here you are, you're developing your product. Think about where you want to be. So if you do want to hold on to that and you want to get the approval and market it yourself, you need to know what route you want to go through. I said, let's take the other situation where you might want to license it out. I said, are you ready for that? Yeah, he says, we're going to have really good clinical data. I said, okay. Does the clinical data show that the product has value? He said, what do you mean? I said, well, let's take the case where your product is a blood pressure medicine, and it's going to cost $100 a month for this blood pressure medicine. But the standard of care is out there, and it's been out there forever, and it costs $20 a month. Now, is your product 5 times better in reducing cardiovascular issues and reducing costs and reducing blood pressure than the standard of care? So I never thought about that. I said, well, the company you're going to license this to is absolutely going to think about this because they have to sell it. And if you don't have data to show that you have not only quality, safety, and efficacy, but that you have value, you're kind of cutting off one leg of your table and it's going to fall down. So you need to start thinking about collecting things like patient-reported outcomes and other kinds of criteria that will prove the value of your medicine. So I think sometimes small companies think very strongly about the technology and, how am I going to evolve this and how am I going to scale up? But they don't necessarily think about these pathways that are needed on the regulatory side and on the value side, especially if they're thinking of licensing out. And just to say, if I have to put together a package to license out my product and I can prove quality, safety, and efficacy, that's great. But if I can prove quality, safety, efficacy, and value, that's a lot greater. And that will make my asset worth a whole lot more. But it takes a lot of foresight and a lot of early thinking to build that into your program, your development program.
Yeah, definitely. Very well said. Getting clinical data and looking at patient outcomes should be the primary goal of any product you're developing. And yeah, sometimes people may lose sight of that when they're developing a product. So yeah, definitely very, very well said. And it's definitely a reminder to all our listeners who are entrepreneurs and starting their own company that you should definitely look at patient outcomes more than the scalability of the product and the commercialization.
Just
One
to say, my bias would be that if I were starting my own company, probably after a chief scientific officer, I'd hire a regulatory person.
yeah,
Because the science is going to drive what I've got, but the regulatory guy is going to drive how I'm going to get to my goal.
Right. Yeah. Equally as important, maybe more. Um, So, I also like based on I wanted to take a step back when you were in university, and what your experience was like there. So I know you earned your PhD in international regulatory policy and also previously studied pharmacy and pharmaco
Cognizy. Yeah.
cognizy. And specifically within that, how did these academic experiences shape your regulatory career?
I think I was fortunate in that in my generation, when we were in pharmacy school, we were exposed to many, many different aspects of what would be considered the art of pharmacy. So yes, we learned pharmacology and we learned anatomy and physiology, but we also learned all the chemistry, organic, inorganic chemistry, physical chemistry. So we understood things from the chemical side, we understood it from the physiologic side, the pharmacologic side, anatomy and physiology. But we also had courses that were required in manufacturing. We would go down, in the labs, and we had pill presses, tablet presses, and we'd make our own tablets and we make lotions and creams. We also had practice of pharmacy labs where back then we had to compound materials ourselves. How do you make a lotion for a dog or a person? That's a very specific combination of products. What that did was it gave us different perspectives. It wasn't just an ointment that came in a tube. We understood what an elegant ointment was versus an inelegant ointment. We understood that if we were going to develop products, they should look in a particular way, or they should be easy to make or dissolve appropriately. So we're learning the whole basket of things that we needed to understand everything from pharmacology and the initial identification of a product through the chemistry, and then clinical, what are clinical impacts and clinical effects. And we didn't know that we were really being prepared for regulatory. But by the time we got to regulatory, we said, wait a minute, I know this thing about clinical. I studied clinical response. I know what they're talking about here. Or chemistry manufacturing control section. Yeah, I had this whole lab on quality. And I remember it was important to understand good manufacturing procedures. So today, pharmacy is more clinical. I don't think students necessarily have the option to even investigate things like manufacturing their own tablets and their own ointments. They could be exposed through internships, which would be really fascinating. Uh, but I think today's educated pharmacist is much more a clinician. And that's great because if you were to go into regulatory, you definitely understand how to interpret the clinical material that has to go into a regulatory filing and can help again with speaking to the people in clinical and cajoling them to get you the right information. Does that completely prepare you for regulatory? At the undergraduate level, probably not. And that's why I think things like the progressive master's degree that we have in our department are brilliant because you can take, biochemistry as an undergrad, but then you can take your master's in regulatory science concomitantly and gain those detailed knowledges about regulatory procedures and all the things we've been talking about over the last few minutes. Uh, and then certainly having experience helps, but getting your foot in the door in a pharma company is the most important thing.
Yeah, definitely. Very well said. Based on that, like going back, like were there any specific uh, things you would have wished you did better or focused on more during your PhD or undergraduate that you think would have made a bigger impact in your career later on?
Right. So I had a kind of a unique educational experience. Just like you, I was young. I went to pharmacy school and immediately went to graduate school for 2 years and got my master's after that. And I felt pretty good about understanding what a pharmacist does and a little bit about understanding what people do in industry. But I wish at the undergraduate level I had had more exposure to what actually happens in industry. How does the pharmaceutical industry work? How is it organized? how do products go through the development process. I wish I had had more of that taught to me. And that's where things like these advanced degrees that we're talking about can fill in the gaps. Or, if you do a progressive master's during your baccalaureate, that will help. So I was unique because, yeah, I got my master's, but then I went to work and I had a family and everything else happened. And one day, a friend of mine who ran the doctoral program at Utrecht University, we met at a conference and he said, Larry, I think it's time you get your doctorate. And I said, well, I'd love to. I've always wanted to, but do you think this is the right time? And he said, it's always the right time. And I said, the man's name was Bert Lufkins. And I said, Bert, I'm 60 years old. He said, so what's the difference? He said, I'm 61, so we can work on this together. And he had already been, a PhD and a pharmacist for many, many years. But even at 60, starting to get that advanced education was a wonderful experience and taught me things I didn't know, even through all of the experiences I had. So whether you wait 60 or 40 years like I did, 35 years before getting your doctorate, or you just wait maybe 5 or 10 years and you go for a doctorate like in our program, where it's designed for people who are working. Having that advanced degree can give you an edge and it can teach you things that maybe you've been exposed to, but you didn't quite understand why they worked the way they did. And that's always important, is to keep asking why is this happening? How do if I don't understand why it's happening, I can't change it.
Right. Definitely. And it reminds me of conversation which we had with one of our previous guests, where a PhD degree, he said, was more for asking questions, more so in a scientific route, whereas a master's would be more so generalist to prepare you for industry. And would you agree with that, or is there a specific nuance to it that you think might be the case?
I think that's brilliant what he said. The way it was explained to me was similar. I was told at the master's level, you're asking what is happening.
Mhm.
And at the doctoral level, you're asking why is it happening?
Yeah.
And I've always kept those two in mind because I learned through my own practical experience that that's exactly the way it worked. When I did my master's, it was around adulteration of ginseng products. And we were asking, well, what's there? What's not there? Is there ginseng? Is there not ginseng? But I didn't really have the opportunity to delve into, well, why is it happening? Or what are the impacts of this, et cetera. So when I got to study for the PhD, and I started focusing in on these specialized regulatory pathways, these facilitated regulatory pathways, the question came up, well, why can we develop a better pathway? How can we do that? What are the things we need to think about to make recommendations around more efficient and more effective pathways? So yeah, part of it was what's out there. We had to do some scanning to understand what, but then we did a lot of deep dives into why they were acting the way they were to be able then to make recommendations to improve them.
Right. I feel like that specific what versus why distinction would be very helpful to our listeners. And I wanted to touch up upon one more thing, was that you've been an educator at USC and also Temple University. What were some key gaps in how university prepares students for regulatory careers today?
Yeah, I think the beauty of having been involved with Temple's program and now USC is that these are very mature programs. They've been around for years, decades. And over the decades, they've refined themselves to know what is it that students need. So when I think of both the programs that I've been involved with, they evolved in a way that ensured that there weren't many gaps.
Mm.
I can envision other programs maybe having gaps, and I suspect that those programs might be more didactic. They may be more about, okay, memorize this and know these 5 regulations, as opposed to the way that Temple and the way that we teach at the Department of Regulatory and Quality Science, which is how do you apply this learning? Okay, nowadays you can find anything on the internet. So keeping it under your hat isn't necessarily the measure of somebody's brilliance. It's really understanding how to apply that and how to interpret those activities. So I think that a good quality education teaches you how to think and teaches you how to take those facts, which, yeah, you need to learn some of them and commit them to memory, but how you apply them and how you find the connections between those elements really sets programs apart. And I think we do a good job, at USC of teaching our students across all our colleges how to connect the dots.
That's very cool. I think, yeah, university is invaluable, and I'm sure programs like that at USC and Temple do help students in preparing them for industry. Um, Now let's talk about the future of, I guess, your role and how you think the industry is moving forward. The regulatory landscape is constantly evolving. So what do you think are the biggest challenges that regulators will face in the next decade?
Yeah, that's a really great question. As you can see, what's happened in just the last 2 months in the United States and how things have been put into some turmoil, and you multiply this times 100 some odd different countries, which each one might be put into turmoil for one reason or another, it becomes this incredibly dynamic landscape. And keeping up with that dynamic change is very, very hard. Now, I'd say that today it's a little easier because of technology, that our ability to search for information, to keep up to date is very, very good. The downside is I get inundated with information. I open my emails in the morning and I have 7 or 8 different summaries of regulatory activities. And I'm thinking, I don't have time to read through all of these. And this is just from one day. So keeping up is a real challenge. I think that we need to prepare ourselves for this constant change. It's the buzzword in regulatory. And for as much as we want there to be alignment, harmonization, sometimes that doesn't work. I'll give you an example. When I started my doctorate, this was about 15 years ago. One of the things we wanted to know was when it comes to these specialized pathways, priority pathways, accelerated pathways, which ones were there? So we did an analysis and we scanned the literature as best we could. And I don't remember the exact number, but I think we found about 25 different pathways. And we wrote an article about it. We thought, my gosh, this is amazing, right? And then I did my research and made recommendations around what these pathways should look like. Fast forward to today, and in the FRPath database, this is at frpath.org, we now have 270 different pathways. Are they the same? Kind of, maybe. Are they unique? Yeah, for sure. If I'm a specialist, how am I going to keep tabs on 270? And we've added something like 15 in the last 90 days. So these things are proliferating with very little alignment, very little harmonization. Basic elements are there, but when it comes to the nuances, they vary a lot. So this is the kind of challenge that we have to meet, right? Is to say, how do we keep up with all of this constant change? And maybe how could we put the brakes on some of it? Because it will be unsustainable if we keep moving in this direction. So there are many groups that are working on this to try to, be sure that we've got harmonization and alignment that are moving in the right direction. But there are forces that sometimes contravene that, and that's a challenge.
Definitely. And I know you just mentioned it, but I was going to follow up on that. Is that, do you see alignment, global alignment, and global harmonization being a possibility in the future, or is this something that is just more idealistic and a concept, a very theoretical concept?
Well, I think it depends what we're talking about, right? So one would have to be a little bit more specific about what we want to align. And I'll give you an example, alignment around the use of a very technical document. It's called the Certificate of Pharmaceutical Product, CPP. So I get my product approved by the US FDA, and I can get what's called a CPP, the Certificate of Pharmaceutical Product. It's apostilled, it has this nice ribbon on it, and okay, it's official, right? And it used to be that I have to take that official document and I walk it over to country A and then country B and country C. But what's happening is that people are saying, whoa, we have really good technology for security to be sure these things aren't um, falsified. And now they've developed the eCPP, the electronic CPP. So now we have a global movement towards the utilization of the eCPP. Let's move away from this document with different color-coded ribbons. Let's move to the eCPP. And that's moving pretty quickly. So that's an example of where alignment can help, but you have to narrow it down. You can't just say, can we have global alignment?
Yeah.
We can have regional initiatives where different countries work together. That's very popular in Africa and Middle East. But even there are the constituent agencies, and each have their own flavor of what they're doing. So what they do is they work together. They will get an agreement, let's say at this group level, but then national authorities still have their own ability to approve or disapprove. They want their sovereign right to make a decision, which makes sense, but it kind of defeats the effort of having a regional alignment initiative if, in fact, those decisions still can get scuttled at the national level. So we're moving in the right direction, and there are still things that we have to work out to optimize these approaches. So global alignment at the highest level for everything, no. But if we take it bit by bit and eat that elephant one bite at a time, I think we can align many activities.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You talked about ChatGPT and stuff. So I want to move towards, I guess, like advanced technology affecting how we work. How do you see AI and machine learning shaping the future of regulatory science with decision making in drug development?
I think there are some amazing opportunities. And I know that there was an initiative at FDA, and I have to say, I don't know where it stands right now. Okay. But the initiative was based on this concept. FDA gets data packages, right? These submissions about drugs, and they've been getting them for 50 years, right? So take any particular therapeutic area, let's say antihypertensives, and they've probably received 50 data packages on antihypertensives. And somebody said, why don't we apply machine learning or AI or whatever we want to call it, some new technology, to those 50 dossiers? Masses of information. But maybe we can start seeing trends. Maybe we can start understanding more about the safety of products. Maybe we can understand how many patients do we need to evaluate to get some kind of clinical efficacy. Maybe we don't need 20,000. Maybe we only need 2,000. But by applying technology to this massive information, we can now come up with a valid way of making a decision about products that are coming down the pike. So if somebody has a new antihypertensive, ideally we'd be able to learn from those previous 50. Theoretically, you could do this. You could go on the FDA website and you could download all that information because it's publicly available. It's summarized, but there's a lot of information there. And you could apply AI, machine learning, to products for psoriasis or products for some other therapeutic area that maybe as a small company, a development company, you've got an idea that you want to develop a drug, let's say for psoriasis. Why not? Why couldn't you download all of the public assessment reports for psoriasis products from the FDA, from the European Medicines Agency website, and other websites around the world, and do an analysis of those and see what kind of learnings you could have from that? So I think there's lots of opportunities. I mean, obviously, people are now saying there's great opportunities to create the dossiers that are being submitted to the agency because you can teach. a program, you should put X here and Y here and format it this way. And that could be a big time and cost savings.
Yeah, that makes lots of sense. I think AI and machine learning is gonna affect every uh, single career path or every organization in these kinds of ways where it like fastens the development of any process, right? It automates lots of things. So thinking of that next generation or future, what advice would you give to the next generation of biotech and regulatory leaders looking to make an impact in their specific industries?
A big trend we've seen is the development of niche products. These are products for high unmet medical need. If you take a look at the products that have been approved in the last couple of years by the FDA, over 50% of those are for oncology or for very niche diseases, right? Orphan diseases, things like that. And I'm of two minds. I think on one hand, it's brilliant because our understanding of human physiology is growing and growing, so we can now target the way that we approach diseases. And that's really important because that means that the efficacy of our drugs is going to become greater and greater, right? Because we're targeting them. It's not a scattershot approach. So to my mind, that's great. What does that do for the basic unmet medical needs? There are diseases like schizophrenia, still huge unmet medical need there. We really don't treat that very well. Is anybody tackling that? Yeah, a few companies, but not as many as tackling some of these very unique diseases, right? Now, part of that is what the return on investment could be. You know, if you can charge $1 million for a therapy or 5 million because it's curative, well, there's an impact there, both societal because you've cured a disease, but also financial. How do we cover a $5 million therapy? On the other hand, should we invest more in things that are good for public health, different kinds of vaccines for diseases that are out there? Maybe we could develop who knows, an E. coli vaccine so that we don't have to worry about tainted chicken, right? But I don't know. That's an equation that people have to balance. And so again, I'm of two minds because I can see small, innovative development companies coming up with these brilliant solutions to niche diseases. But on the other hand, are we letting the rest of the population go? We really don't have good treatments for diabetes. Not yet, really, right? Hypertension, pretty bad, right? Certain cardiovascular diseases, not great, you know. So how we actually think about the societal needs versus the return on investment is, I think, going to be a big factor in future drug development.
Yeah, definitely. Actually, one thing that comes to mind when you talk about a $5 million therapy is gene therapies. Those have been popping up quite a lot recently, especially with sickle cell anemia. There's one-time cure for it now, but it costs $3 million, which is a lot of money. Um, my question on that was, how do you see those kind of therapies being regulated? In terms of, because they're not typical drugs where you can just mass produce them and just send them over to wherever. It's more so sample by sample, person by person.
Yeah. And I think we're all wrestling with that right now, is trying to figure that out. So there's a couple of issues. One is just the technology, that the people that we need to be able to evaluate those technologies at the agency level. You need some very sophisticated scientists to be able to evaluate that. And there aren't going to be many agencies around the world that can do that. So what'll happen is, the FDA, the European Medicines Agency, the Japanese PMDA, maybe Singapore, and a couple of others that are very well resourced will be able to do a primary evaluation of those kinds of products. Other agencies who don't have that, will have to rely on the decisions of the FDA and the EMA. And that happens now. It's called reliance, regulatory reliance. They're going to be challenged and say, okay, I understand how this works in an American population or a European, but is that relevant to my population in Ecuador or my population in Zimbabwe? That's where it's going to be very tricky to make that leap, that transition between the reference agency's decision and then how it has an impact at the local level. Now, I'm only talking like quality, safety, and efficacy. I'm not talking about finances because that'll be a whole other discussion. Can a Zimbabwe afford a $3 million curative um, issue, a product? Um, that's a tough one, and that's where balancing public health needs becomes very real and difficult decisions, especially where there are largely uh, national healthcare payment systems, which is pretty much the whole rest of the world outside of the United States. We have a very unique system, but now we're seeing why push is coming to shove. So let's say you get sick and the doctor says, I've got this cure that's going to cost $3 million. And your insurance company says, yow, $3 million. I got to pay $3 million. So they say, but wait a minute. Next year, you may not be with me anymore. Your employer may go to company B.
Right.
So all of a sudden, I paid $3 million for you, and I'm never going to see another penny from you. Why should I be saddled with $3 million worth of expense? Which is really legitimate, right? Because we have no consistency in our loyalty to individual insurance companies. So insurers are thinking about novel ways of amortizing those costs. And, I'm sure they'll come up with brilliant ways of doing that. But I can understand why an insurer would say, why should I put up $1 million for this particular treatment when I have no guarantee that I'm going to get any more revenue from you?
Mm. That would be- Yeah, it's definitely a very unique problem because like we've never seen cures, like complete cures for diseases ever, and at that price especially. So it's definitely a very unique challenge to navigate regulatory and also through funding. So yeah, like very well said. So we're just going to move on to our last section now, which is rapid fire questions. You can you can answer these questions in a sentence to a word, depending on how long. Um, so our first question to you is, what topic within the pharmaceutical and biotech industry do you love the most?
I think it is personalized medicine.
Okay, perfect. What is a fun fact regarding your role? So, like, what do you love about your?
It's the global view that I
Okay.
really like, is the diversity in how different organizations work, and that it doesn't matter what I've learned. It doesn't matter if your regulatory agency is big or small. The people in the regulatory agencies all want to do the right thing. They're there to support the public health. And I've yet to see an agency that isn't committed to that.
That's great. And on the flip side of that question, what is something you dislike about your role?
About my job is the inertia, the slowness of change. Yeah, that it really takes a long time to see major impacts.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, regulatory is definitely a very slow moving path. That is one of the biggest reasons why clinical trials take so long and developing a drug takes so long. But I feel like it's much needed. It's not it's understandable as to why it's so long because it's human safety and then you're putting it in humans. So I'd rather take more time than less. Um, what is an interesting networking story that taught you a lot?
Interesting networking story. Hmm. Um, I think one of the things I've learned is that when it comes to networking, you should always keep your doors open and always stay positive and friendly with the people you meet. And it's because you never know when you're going to meet them again.
Mhm.
And just today, in fact, I was on a teleconference, a webinar, uh, and there was a woman who was on the webinar, and I recognized her name. And she said, Larry, it's been so long since we've met. And she worked for a major pharmaceutical company years ago, and we had met maybe 10 years ago. And there she was, and she recognized me, and we had had a very fun relationship. So it was great. And that similar kind of thing happened with a regulator. So at the Kim Center, we are a designated Center of Excellence for Device Training. And we held a training last year, and there was a woman who was at the training from Papua New Guinea. And we held a training right here on campus at USC. And, when she was registering, you know how you look at somebody and you think, boy, I know this person, right? And she looked and I looked, and we said, okay, where do we know each other from? Well, it turns out that almost 15 years ago, I was at a training session in Taiwan that she had attended with a colleague of hers. And we both remembered sitting under a covered table, a picnic table. It was drizzling rain, and we were eating our dinner together. And here it was almost 15 years later, and we ran across each other and still remembered each other. So these networks are lifelong.
Definitely. Wow. Very, very well said. Honestly, very poetic in a way. It's amazing. Okay, so for our next question is, what is your favorite source of biotech, pharmaceutical, or any healthcare related information?
Information? In regulatory, the thing is that there's really one source, one good source, and so I do like to Google things. I'm still old school. I don't use AI necessarily to get there, so I like to Google things and just to not read the little summary that it comes back, but to just dive right in and see what kind of information I can find. So I've worked with many databases and others. And it depends what I'm looking for. Sometimes the databases are good, sometimes not so good. But I like to just do my own searches and see what I can find and then synthesize that information. And then sometimes I'll go back to ChatGPT or another generative AI and see if I was on the right track.
Yeah, definitely. And for our final question of the episode, what is a wise quote that has stuck with you over the years?
So the quote is, if somebody offers you something that seems too good to be true, as long as it doesn't put you in danger, follow it up. And the reason is that I had two episodes where that happened. One, very briefly, was where I was offered a castle in Italy when I was a young man. And I thought, no way. And then eventually, through finding things on the internet, I realized that it was a real offer. The gentleman had no family. He liked me, and he was going to leave me his castle. And I didn't take it. And the second was I had an opportunity to go to medical school. And I found 3 ways from Sunday to say, no, I couldn't possibly do it. No way can I do this. There's no way. And I didn't.
Yeah.
And to this day, I regret that because it was a great opportunity that sounded too good to be true. And yet I probably should have done it and I could have done well.
Yeah. Honestly, like it is definitely it's an opposite to what most people think. Like, if something's too good to be true, you should be very like speculative, you should be very careful because it's most probably there's some catch to it. But yeah, like this is also another very interesting way to look at it, where if something is too good to be true and it doesn't hurt you too much, why not follow it up? That's a very good why not do it.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was honestly wonderful. It was great to, I guess, talk to you about your experiences both in regulatory and in just like your journey through pharmaceutical sciences and biotechnology. So that is a wrap, guys, today for the episode on It's Bigger Than Biotech. A huge thank you to Dr. Lawrence Liberti for sharing his insights on regulatory science, global policy, and the future of biotech innovation. His work has shaped how medicines reach patients worldwide, and his dedication to education and regulatory excellence is truly inspiring. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with your network, especially anyone looking to break into biotech, pharma, or regulatory affairs. And if you want to learn more about Dr. Liberty's work, check out the DK Kim International Center for Regulatory Science at USC and the RUD Foundation. As always, thank you for tuning in. Stay curious, stay innovative, and we'll see you next time on It's Bigger Than Biotech. Thank you.